One chestnut horse stood watch each night as darkness engulfed the forest. Its eyes were riveted on the curving route ahead, despite the cold and the animal's unbroken calm at the edge of the trees. When Ranger Caleb eventually learnt the tragic truth of the horse's nightly watch, his presence enthralled him. It was a clear autumn day, and he was moved to tears, wondering what could inspire such affection and grief in such a magnificent creature. Nightfall, and the sounds of rustling leaves and far-off wildlife filled the forest. Caleb Walker was an experienced forest. A ranger with a strong passion for the outdoors was walking the path close to the park's edge, which he had always thought about. The forest is his sanctuary, a haven of wonder and tranquility. Yet that night, he noticed alone. The appearance of a horse at the forest's edge, silhouetted against the waning twilight, was both serene and eerie, with its sleek coat glowing dimly in the moonlight, its posture still, and patient appearing nearly. Caleb slowed his pace, examining the creature, wondering why it was here. Curiosity piqued as Caleb approached, alone and still at such an early hour. Taking care not to frighten the animal, the big horse didn't flinch. Caleb felt uneasy as its expressive eyes stayed focused on the trail that headed deeper into the woods. But over the course of the following few evenings, Caleb realized that it also sparked a sense of mystery and subdued melancholy in him. The horse continued to perform its ritual in the same position and started to observe from a distance as the shadows each. The horse remained steadfast and unwavering in its attention, seemingly waiting for something or someone that never materialized. Caleb chose to look more closely after deciding he could no longer ignore the odd sight. Squatting close to the edge of the woodland and whispering to the animal, "What are you waiting for, old friend?" Caleb, the horse moved a little, its ears twitching in recognition, but it remained motionless. He couldn't get rid of the impression that one was engraved in the silent resolve of the horse's nocturnal vigil. But the next morning, discovering it would alter his entire understanding of loyalty and grief. As the first rays of sunshine appeared, Caleb couldn't get the image of the horse standing watch at the edge of the woodland out of his mind. He sipped his coffee while thinking about the past as it passed by his cabin windows. Caleb knew animals well. Therefore, the horse's behavior wasn't just strange. It was intentional, sufficient to discern when something went beyond instinct. He chose to speak with his co-worker Hannah, a local veterinarian who had collaborated extensively with him on local wildlife rescues. Caleb had complete faith in her, but Caleb, not only for her knowledge, but also for her compassion for animals over lunch. "It's always there, Hannah," he added in a curious tone as he recounted the odd details of the previous several nights. "And worry, the same location, the same posture, as if it's waiting for someone. Perhaps, but I've never witnessed a horse behave in this way." Hannah scowled as she leaned back in her chair. She acknowledged that it's strange, especially at night. "Do you believe it's a stray? Could have been abandoned? I'm not sure. It doesn't appear malnourished or injured. Its coat is clean, and it's not skittish," Caleb said, shaking his head. "Something seems to be looking for something in its eyes." Hannah considered for a second before recommending. "Perhaps it's connected to someone or something in the forest. Animals tend to build stronger relationships." Caleb, who was intrigued by the concept, chose to pay more attention to the horse that night and brought a thermos. As evening descended on the forest, they were determined to learn more about its behavior and brought a notebook, coffee, and a blanket. With his binoculars aimed on the horse, he established a peaceful vantage point close to the wood's edge. The horse arrived as the final light. With its head raised high and its tail swishing, it walked purposefully as the day faded. Gently, it came to a halt once more at the same location, gazing into the forest. Caleb observed how meticulous the procedure was, with each step appearing purposeful as though. Caleb stared for hours, taking notes while being led by an unseen power. The horse stood as if time itself didn't matter. It didn't graze, wander, or even seem restless. Around midnight, Caleb made the decision to approach and wrap his blanket around his head as his eyes locked on the dark route ahead. Shoulders to protect himself from the cold as he approached the horse in silence. The horse's head twisted slightly. Caleb said in a quiet voice, "You're not just lost, are you?" while acknowledging his presence without displaying any anxiety. "Caleb, what are you searching for outside?" The horse huffs softly, revealing its breath in the chilly air. To his astonishment, the horse didn't draw away when he tentatively stretched out and brushed his fingers against its silky coat. He stood motionless, letting Caleb touch him. And when he noticed something strange, the leather band that was still fastened to the horse's neck was a piece of a halter that had faded and frayed with time. But no, when a tag or identification was found, Caleb's interest grew. The following morning, Caleb went back to town and started asking around. He went to neighboring farms, chatted with people at the general store, and he even posted a note on the community board asking if anyone was missing a horse. But each time he received the same response. With a perplexed shake of his head, Caleb said, "You're chasing a ghost." An elderly farmer laughed. "If nobody has claimed it yet." Caleb wasn't persuaded by the horse's behavior and state, even though it probably doesn't belong to anyone in the area. Implied a more complex tale that someone needed to know more about since the days. As Caleb's bond with the horse deepened, he began feeding it fresh apples and carrots, and he talked to it for a while, expressing his ideas and opinions out loud. He would add, "You have a story, don't you?" as he watched the horse's ears flash as though he was listening. "I'll figure out one day." In the evening, while sitting next to the horse at the edge of the forest, Caleb saw something on the ground close by that he had never seen before. The path was delicate, with the horse's hooves creating a thin track of disturbed leaves that led deeper into the woods. It was hardly noticeable, yet Caleb's heartbeat accelerated. "Is this what?" He asked the horse something in there, and Caleb heard the horse snort quietly, which he assumed as. After getting confirmation, he turned to the horse one last time while holding his torch and getting ready to follow the track. "Stay still, okay? I'll figure out what you're protecting." The horse's eyes remained fixed as Caleb stepped. Caleb followed a faint but unmistakable track into the forest shadows, navigating through the thick underbrush of. The air was cooler in the forest, and it smelt strongly of damp moss. Foliage. Caleb's torch glow pierced the shadows to show LWH hanging limbs and gnarled roots that tugged at his coat as he looked over his shoulder every few paces, despite. The horse had remained behind, and Caleb sensed its presence as a silent guide that pushed him on the farther he went. Even worse, the forest turned into the typical nightly symphony of insects, owls, and hooting. Instead, there was a spooky silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath following what felt like. After what seemed like an hour, Caleb discovered something unexpected, a tiny clearing lit by the faint glow of. The remains of an aged and overtaken wooden structure stood in the middle, with moonlight filtered through the canopy. "What is this place, Caleb?" Moss covered what was left of the roof, and vines wound around shattered beams. As he studied the remains, he stepped closer and mumbled. Something drew his attention. Scattering of objects on the ground next to the building's door. He lowered his torch and saw a child's toy, a carved wooden horse with faded paint that is still evident next to it. Caleb's hands shook as he opened the rusting tin box with the lid slightly open. There were photographs in a box, their edges yellowed with age. They were blurry but sufficiently clear to show a small child standing next to a horse Caleb's breath caught. The horse in the picture seemed remarkably similar to. He said, "This can't be a coincidence," to the person waiting at the edge of the forest. Looking over the pictures, each one revealed a tale of the youngster and horse's friendship, caught in happy moments, and Caleb's gaze was drawn to adventure, a folded piece of paper at the bottom of the box. When he carefully unfolded it, he discovered a handwritten note that was still readable despite the dirty ink. The words, "Please take care of my friend. She means everything to me," chilled Caleb to his core. The letter was dated more than 20 years ago. Caleb stood looking around the clearing for any hints about. A torch beam struck a crude wooden cross that was buried in the ground as a makeshift grave monument. The realization struck him like a tidal wave, emblazoned with the single word, Evelyn. It was morning when the horse was waiting, and this area with the ruined building wasn't just any old place. Of great importance, a link to a history that had been virtually forgotten before Caleb could comprehend more. A rustle in the brush behind him abruptly broke the quiet, and he spun around, his heart thumping. Using a torch Two bright eyes peered at him from the shadows as a coyote emerged, its slender body visible. Caleb froze, his head whirling with coyotes and keen fangs glinting in the light. Weren't usually hostile towards people, but this one appeared unusual, with a low, stiff posture and a fixed look. Caleb started to draw away gradually, while maintaining a torch focus on the animal, but he heard more rustling as he went, and soon a coyote appeared. Another magnificent, Caleb whispered to himself, while clutching a strong branch that he'd picked up earlier. The coyote started to circle him, and this was exactly what I needed. Caleb's mind raced, but he couldn't outrun them in the dense because of their precise and careful actions. He needed a plan, but all of a sudden, a sharp, authoritative whinny reverberated through the woods. The coyotes' ears froze when they heard the horse's distinct sound. Caleb turned towards the sound and used the opportunity to yell and flash his torch, making himself appear bigger. His motions and the horse's presence appeared to frighten the predators, who slunk back one by one. Caleb ran back towards them as their bright eyes vanished into the shadows, relieved but uneasy. The horse was standing at the edge of the forest when he came out of the trees. Its eyes locked with Caleb's, motionless as a sentinel, and for a time he felt. With a scratchy voice, Caleb exclaimed, "You saved me," as if the animal understood everything that had just transpired. Gratitude grew in the man's chest as he stretched out to stroke the horse. But why? What brought you there? The horse's eyes were riveted on Caleb that night with silent intensity. He spread the pictures and the message on his kitchen table to study after returning home with more questions than answers. The horse had belonged to someone profoundly connected to the story, and each one seemed to have a secret. Linked to the clearing, a youngster who had been so devoted to it that he had left a sincere request for its protection. But what had? Why had the horse returned after all these years? What happened to the boy? Caleb knew he couldn't stop now that the horses. He decided to look further, since devotion and tenacity deserved answers, beginning with the municipal archives. If there were any records of the youngster, the building, or the tomb, he would discover the next morning. Caleb woke up feeling a fresh sense of. His mind was permanently marked with the pictures of the destroyed area, the haunting message, and, as he sipped his coffee, Caleb couldn't get rid of the impression that the horse was counting on him to find out the truth. Displayed the pictures and the message once more, carefully examining each detail. The boy's young face in the images had a startling likeness to a person Caleb believed he had seen previously, but he was unable to pinpoint the location of the note's brief suggestion. Had a connection that lasted beyond time, and the gravestone bearing Evelyn's name bore a somber burden. He chose to. If anyone had documents about the building in the forest or its residents, they should start with the local archives. Caleb, putting the pictures and the letter in his backpack for the town's historical society. Despite the bitter morning cold, he left the archives with an unwavering resolve. "Caleb, you're up early." Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly librarian, gave him a warm greeting. "What brought you here today?" "I need to look up some records," she added, smiling. Caleb replied, placing the. "Do you know anything about a family who may have resided close to the woodland edge based on the photos and message on the counter?" Mrs. Hargrove knitted her brows because there was a structure, a cottage, or something, and this horse appeared to be attached to it. As she looked at the pictures, she muttered, "This looks familiar," adjusting her. There was a family rental in Glassware, a region that hasn't been inhabited for decades. She shuffled to an adjacent shelf and, after flipping a thick ledger with fading gold lettering, pulled it out. She paused as she traced a line of text across multiple pages. "Here it is," she added, her tone laced with melancholy. "The Langfords lived in a small cabin on the edge of the forest. The boy in these pictures must be their son, Jacob Langford Caleb," who barely echoed the name. Knowing what had occurred to them, Mrs. Hargrove's face was filled with sorrow. She whispered that Jacob's father died after his mother, Evelyn, died of a disease when he was quite young. Samuel had a hard time keeping things together, and everyone in the village knew that the youngster and his horse were inseparable. Their relationship. But one day when Jacob was around 10, he vanished. According to his father, he sought assistance, but he never returned, sending a shiver down Caleb's back as he cleared the grave marker. His voice just over his head Do you think the horse I found could be the same one? And everything started to make sense. Mrs. Hargrove's eyes widened at the whisper. If it is, that horse is a Myrick Earl. Animals can have remarkable memories, but they would need to be decades old, Caleb. Perhaps it has returned to provide closure, or to honor the relationship it had with that boy. And the seriousness of her remarks has subsided. Caleb thanked Mrs. Hargrove and made a copy of all the information she had about the Langfords. Not much, but enough to support Caleb's next move later that day. Equipped with the new knowledge, he went back to the jungle with a plan to reconstruct the events that had unfolded years ago. The horse was waiting at the edge of the woodland, calm as usual. Unflinching manner. Let's see what transpired. Girl, Caleb patted the. Together, they walked the route back to the clearing, this time with Caleb. Looked all over the ruins in the hopes of finding something he had missed the previous evening close to the remains of. Beneath the ash, he discovered a tiny tin that contained a single photograph with burnt edges, but it still shows Jacob standing in front of the cabin with his horse, clutching a handmade wooden figurine that perfectly resembles Caleb's horse breast. The horse had been Jacob's lifeline, and his partner had thrown it. So this wasn't just any animal. Unbearable sorrow. But why had the horse come back again after all these years? As the sun sank below the horizon, Caleb returned to town with the horse in tow. This is confirmed by the fact that he visited Mrs. Hargrove's home shortly after to show her the recently found photo. With a voice trembling with emotion, Mrs. Hargrove stated that the horse is a living piece of history, bearing Jacob's. Caleb nodded, his resolve stiffening as he recalled his love after all this time. Jacob mentioned that perhaps the horse is waiting for someone to finally provide closure. Therefore, I need to find out what happened to him. Mrs. Hargrove smiled reassuringly at him, saying, "You're on the right track, Caleb. Trust the horse. Understand more than we could have ever imagined. And the burden of." He sat at his window, gazing out at the starlit sky and the horse that might be seen there, the mystery pressing down on him. As if protecting something holy, it stood still at the boundary of his property. The following day, Caleb decided to see another location that may provide clues to the remains of the Langford family's tombstones at the town. The morning broke with a gray sky, and he hoped to uncover further hints in the cemetery or even in Jacob's final resting place. Caleb's growing interest and uneasiness following a restless night was mirrored by the cloudy sky. At night, he collected his notes, photos, and the tin containing the burned image. He had resolved to go to the Langford family graves at the town cemetery today in order to learn more, their tale in the hopes that it would shed light on why the horse stood firm at the edge of the woodland. The horse was waiting as. Normally, when Caleb went outside, its serene presence felt strangely comforting. Caleb inquired, smiling slightly and petting its head, "Are you coming with me on this journey?" As if it had selected him as its companion. "Okay, let's head to the graveyard." The horse's neck nickered quietly as it nudged his arm. It was a serene, solemn location on the outskirts of town with rows of worn headstones where time appeared to stand still. Caleb guided the horse to the area that stretched beneath the towering oaks, some of which were almost unreadable due to years of erosion. Before entering the caretaker's office in the morning, gently tether it outdoors. "I'm searching for the graves of the elderly caretaker, Mr. Dorson," who looked up from his crossword puzzle when Caleb welcomed him. "Do you know where the Langford family might be?" Mr. Dawson scratched his head reflectively. "Do you think that's?" He walked to a filing cabinet and took out an ancient ledger flipping so I could check the records. "Stephen Langford is buried here in lot 23B through the yellowed pages, but only Evelyn has a grave because neither Jacob nor Samuel Caleb are listed." Mr. Dawson responded that it's not unusual for families to relocate, and the remaining ones are. Armed with the plot number, Caleb headed to 23B, whether he was buried there or not. The gravestone was straightforward and unadorned. Evelyn Langford's name, birth year, and death year are etched into the worn stone. Caleb knelt and brushed away a little bundle of dried wildflowers that had been neatly arranged next to the marker and fastened with a ribbon. The sight of the flowers and the leaves that had gathered around the base made him think. "Who's been coming to see you, Evelyn?" Whispered that someone had visited recently, possibly with greater knowledge of the family situation, while Caleb considered the He turned when he heard footsteps approaching and noticed a young woman holding a little bunch of fresh flowers. She paused. I was shocked to see him because I didn't think anyone else would be here, she added. With hesitation, Caleb looked at the horse that was tethered close. Are you also visiting Evelyn? He said, standing, and I'm trying to find out more about her and her family. Do you know her? The woman hesitated as she brushed dirt from his hands. She was my great aunt, and my grandmother used to tell me stories about her and Jacob while she clutched the flowers. I've been trying to piece together their story, and Caleb's pulse sped up. Do you know what happened to Jacob or his? She moaned, Papa, dropping her eyes to look at my grandmother's parts and pieces, revealed that she had always described Jacob as a peaceful, kind youngster who loved his horse. But after Evelyn passed away, everything came apart, and Samuel changed. According to my grandmother, Jacob ventured into the forest in search of something, either to seek assistance or to flee, but he never returned. Caleb questioned if she thought Samuel might have buried Jacob in the jungle. She shook her head in response. Samuel vanished shortly after Jacob, and no one ever found him. It seems as though they both disappeared into thin air, leaving Caleb with more questions than answers. He thanked the woman and went back to the horse that gave him a little prod while he untied it properly, which didn't give us much, he murmured, flicking its ears as though in disagreement. Caleb saw a guy observing him from the sidelines as he made his way back through town. Caleb turned his head away when he saw the man's piercing eyes in the doorway of a little antique shop. But when Caleb looked back, the man had vanished. The experience had made him uncomfortable. Who was he, and why had he been observing him so intently? The burial, the ruins, and the forest all seemed like pieces of a puzzle to me. It refused to cooperate. Caleb made the decision to go back to the woodland later that day because he couldn't get the sensation to go away. Believed the solutions might be found somewhere in its depths. So this time he took a metal detector in the hopes of finding anything buried under the dirt. The horse trailed him closely as he made his way back to the clearing where the ruins were felt. Changed, now heavier, as if the weight of untold stories were carried by the air itself. Caleb swept the detector over, the dirt close to the fireplace, the gadget beeping softly, gently excavating. He discovered a rusting tin box with tiny trinkets and a child's wooden carving inside that barely held together, with a tarnished locket, a faded painting of a family under a tree, and a horse. As he looked over the contents, Caleb discovered a small picture of Evelyn's kind smile frozen in time when he opened the locket. When Caleb looked up, he saw the horse standing at the edge of the clearing, gazing into the distance with a soft, melancholy whinny. The thick forest, its ears pricked, its body tense. "What is it, Caleb, girl?" inquired in a quiet voice, and the horse poured to the ground before hesitantly moving forward a few paces while keeping its eyes on. Caleb followed the forest, his heart racing from something he couldn't see. Appeared darker, with the woods enclosing him. As he continued on, the horse took him to a tiny clearing that he had never seen before. At the center lay a solitary stone coated in moss that was hardly discernible from the surrounding vegetation. Carved into the stone the grave wasn't marked on any of the two words Jacob Langford. Caleb's breath caught. Maps, and nobody has brought up who had buried Jacob here or why the horse was there. Guided Caleb to this SP, where he stood frozen in front of the moss-covered stone, his thoughts racing because the burial was not marked. Records and the fact that it was deep in the forest indicated that it was buried quickly, but the horse stayed by his side and was stable. Caleb ran his knees and looked at the grave, a quiet testament to the relationship it had with the youngster who now lay beneath the earth. Jacob's fingers over the faint carving caused his thoughts to race with questions about who had Jacob been buried here, and why did the horse appear to be related decades later? Caleb's shoulder was nudged by the horse's gentle snort as he looked up into its expressive eyes, which appeared to be begging him to find out more about what you've been trying to. Caleb whispered, caressing the horse's neck, "Tell me something all along." "What am I missing, Caleb?" Investigated the area surrounding the cemetery. No more marks or signs of a memorial were found. Whoever had buried Jacob had completed quickly but carefully. The dirt beneath the stone was densely packed, as though the idea that the cemetery had been cared for over time made Caleb shiver. Was anyone still coming here after After all these years, the sound of snapping twigs behind him spinning around him broke up his thoughts. Notice the stranger, a man from the antique store, emerged from the shadows, his wrinkled face marked with. The man muttered in a low, gruff voice, "You've found it," with an enigmatic face. Caleb naturally placed himself between the guy and the horse at Jacob's resting spot, not knowing the. He asked, "Who are you, stranger intentions? And how did you find out about this?" The man moved closer and raised his hands in a peace sign. "His name is Walter. I've heard the stories of my grandfather working for the Langfords all my life." Caleb scowled and warmed up. "Walter, if you know so much, why haven't you stepped forward and why have you allowed this boy story to stay hidden?" Whispered softly, "Some wounds are too deep to expose." With a sigh, his eyes lowering to the grave, although it appears the. "Why did Jacob wind up here?" Caleb pressed. "The past doesn't want to remain buried any longer." Walter stopped, his grizzled face furrowed in agony, and Samuel blamed himself for what had happened to him. After Evelyn died, he got fixated on protecting her because she was sick and he was unable to cure her. They were forced into seclusion by Jacob's anxiety, which made him fear that he might lose him as well. Listen carefully, Jacob Walter's voice cracking and his heart heavy as he. Continuing, one night their cabin caught fire, but Samuel was able to save Jacob and the horse. But while he was hurt, he informed my grandfather that Jacob had shortly fled into the forest. After looking for assistance, he never came back. Why didn't Samuel pursue him? Walter's voice was just above a whisper as Caleb asked, his heart fluttering with wrath. Whisper, but Samuel was severely injured, and by the time he recovered, it was too late to find Jacob. In order to remain near the forest they both cherished, he buried him here. Samuel never forgiven himself, and he vanished shortly after. With just the horse remaining, the weight of Walter's remarks descended. Like a dense mist, Caleb gazed at the horse, standing quietly beside the grave, its head bent as though in grief, and Walter's eyes softened as Caleb requested the horse, and it remained close to the forest, waiting for. Over time, Samuel's homecoming became a local legend, with locals claiming the horse was protecting Jacob's tomb and staying put until the family was reunited. But this, Caleb pointed to the horse, saying, "Isn't that the same one?" How could it recall Walter's expression? Become mysterious. Loyalty is more important than memory, regardless of whether the horse. The soul of Jacob's bond animals is carried by one or more of them. Remember to love Caleb the way people do. Struggled to comprehend the revelation. Everything suddenly made sense, including the horse's nightly watch and its persistence on bringing him here. But it made him feel very sad. This boy's life ended too soon, he added quietly, and his story should be. Walter agreed, which is why I followed you and saw you reveal the picture at the ruins. I knew you wouldn't give up until you discovered the truth. Perhaps it's time to tell this tale. They stood silently. The forest surrounding them was eerily silent for a while before Caleb spoke. But there's more. Is there something we're still missing from this? Walter's eyes grew aloof. Caleb and Walter started their trip, but perhaps it's simply the weight of the past urging us to accept it. Caleb prevented the horse from continuing to linger by the cemetery on the way back to town, and turned around, his heart hurting, but he said in a whisper, "It's okay, we'll keep Jacob's." The horse eventually followed its slow, careful motions as if its memory were still alive. It recognized the seriousness of the moment, and for the first time, Caleb felt a strong bond with the animal as well as with. Caleb and Walter exchanged a few words, but the story was filled with unspoken thoughts as they walked back to town. Magnitude of what they had discovered weighing on them. The horse appeared to be obeying Caleb, hesitantly moving at a slower pace than normal, pausing occasionally to glance back at. Caleb sensed the pull of the trees, as though it were attracted to the grave they had just left behind. Additionally, there was an elusive issue that lingered just out of reach, and Walter started to break the silence. If Samuel vanished, where did he go, and why was he never discovered? Walter sighed and furrowed his forehead, which some people claimed was the mystery. Others said he fled to start fresh somewhere far away because he couldn't handle the guilt and killed himself, but no one knows. Caleb definitely shook his head, which bothers me because he loved Jacob so deeply. Why would he simply abandon the horse and the grave beneath Walter's face if he was willing to risk everything for him? My grandfather claimed that Samuel was a broken man when he buried Jacob. Therefore, I've wondered if he... The horse gave a gentle whinny, attracting Caleb's attention, but it had ceased when he felt like he had lost all place in this world. Once more remaining motionless, as Caleb walked up to a statue in the center of the path and put a comforting touch on its neck. The horse's ears twitched, and it turned. "What are we missing, boy?" Its head tilted slightly, perhaps indicating a group of trees off the trail. Caleb scowled. "Walter, have you ever explored?" Walter paused beyond Jacob's grave, but we always assumed the grave. Caleb experienced a burst of resolve, but perhaps it wasn't the conclusion of the story. Walter grudgingly followed the horse as Caleb veered off the path without waiting for a response. The trees grew denser behind them, their twisted branches creating a canopy that made people complain about how late it was. Shut out the last of the sunlight, the temperature dropped, and the woodland floor crunched under their boots as they entered. Stillness until they arrived at a clearing where the remains of what looked to be another building stood. Caleb's heart pounded as he got closer to the eerie silence of the crumbling walls covered in moss and vines. Location that is both haunting and captivating. "What is this?" Walter inquired in a hushed voice. "Caleb." Under the rubble, he knelt by a fallen beam and brushed away leaves and dirt. Discovered a weathered but intact old wooden chest that belonged to a horse. Caleb nuzzled his shoulder as if to persuade him to unlock it. With trembling hands, Caleb opened the... Inside the lid were faded writings, a picture of Jacob and Samuel, and A. Caleb took up the little, tarnished locket with care, brushing his fingers. "With love, Mama," he gave a locket to Walter, revealing its lovely engraving for Jacob, who looked at it with wonder and sorrow, thinking that it must have belonged to Evelyn. Walter claimed that Jacob must have carried it. Caleb focused on the letters with him, which were fragile due to aging. He unfurled the letter, which was addressed with smeared but still readable ink. Caleb's blood ran cold when he saw Samuel and the contents. "Samuel is the one they are coming for. They believe that we are cursed because our problems aren't natural. I'm not sure how long we can remain here." When Jacob read the letter aloud to Evelyn, his voice trailed off. "Curse what?" Does she imply that Walter's face went white? The Langfords were the subject of superstitions and rumors in those days. Claimed that their property was cursed and that anyone who stayed there for too long would experience tragedies including fires, illnesses, and accidents. Caleb's mind was constantly piecing together the details of the family, believing that the locals forced them into seclusion. That they were terrified, Walter nodded grimly. So they let Samuel to bury Jacob here and vanish. Caleb's wrath rose as he tightened his fists. The first time fear made someone harsh. Thus, they erased them and pretended they never existed rather than simply leaving them there. Caleb was startled out of his reverie when the horse whined louder and poured to the ground, its actions intense. Caleb looked at Walter, who shrugged, as if he had not finished demonstrating things to us. They then followed the horse. Caleb looked towards the clearing's far edge, where the ruins of a stone well lay with its wooden cover rotting away. Inside, but it was very black. Walter gave him a torch, and Caleb used a branch to shine the beam into the depths, where it revealed a small rusted object jammed between the stones. His stomach churned as he looked it over and saw an ancient revolver. You believe that Walter's voice was Samuel's? If so, perhaps this well contains more than simply water. Caleb was left with more questions than answers after the revelation increased the mystery. So, when night fell, they made the decision to go back to town and reassemble, although there was a noticeable tension between them. "We'll return, Caleb. There's more to this story I can tell," he continued firmly, his eyes still lingering on the well. Walter nodded, but his eyes showed that he was uncomfortable. "Caleb, be careful." As they made their way back beneath the shadow of darkness, the woodland appeared to be alive with. Caleb tightened, whispering as if it too had secrets it wasn't ready to reveal. Unwavering in his resolve and his hold on the horse's reins, he had traveled too far to let up. Now, back in town, the discovery at Caleb was troubled by the ruins and couldn't get rid of the eerie forest vibe, the unearthed letters, or he felt the horse's restless energy as he walked it back to the barn with the revolver from the well, as though it too was. The stable master, a wiry old man named Gus, was impacted by the day's revelations. Gus said, indicating towards the horse, "Giving you trouble." Observing Caleb's uneasiness as he led the animal into its stall, Caleb responded, rubbing the horse's neck as though he were doing so, as the animal pawed nervously at the ground. Gus leaned against the stable door, his aged face serious, attempting to tell me something. Animals know things, boy. They sense that this one has been waiting for years and that he hasn't let go of Caleb because of something in that forest. Gus's eyes tightened, and he spat before he could say anything. "Do you know anything about Samuel Langford or his family?" I discovered the burial of Caleb's son, who acknowledged that the Langfords had been digging where they shouldn't. "There's more to their story, isn't there?" Gus sighed and took off his hat. "And a letter." And stroking his thinning hair, "A heartbreaking story that one hears in this. When the Langfords needed assistance, the town abandoned them. Most people condemned them and said their bad luck would spread. However, it wasn't a curse, and son. Rather, it was people's cruelty. Why didn't anyone search for Samuel following Jacob's passing? They didn't want to find him. So Caleb questioned with a frustrated tone, and Gus replied plainly that it was simpler to. Caleb clenched his fists, his wrath bubbling beneath the surface. But why would Samuel act as though the Langfords had never existed? Without leaving any trace of what he was so terrified of. Gus paused as if. He lowered his voice as he debated whether or not to offer more. There's discourse about the past. Discuss how Samuel was sufficiently frightened by something he discovered in the woods to avoid going to town. People claim that he saw things that shouldn't have been seen. I'm not sure what type of things Caleb pressed Gus, but he shook his head. All I know is that he took his secrets to the grave, where Caleb left them. Perhaps it was the guilt, or perhaps it was something else. The town's silence on the Langfords wasn't merely a case of negligence. It was a stable and more decided decision than before. He had to consciously erase it so that their story wouldn't conclude this way the next morning. Over a steaming cup of coffee, Caleb and Walter gathered in the cafe and went over the letters and chest contents. Silent witnesses to a catastrophe that had been hidden for decades. The locket and photograph lay between them. "What's our next?" Walter added in a quiet voice. "We need to learn more about Evelyn." Caleb said that if she indeed authored those letters, Walter acknowledged that there's an archive at the library that has ancient property records, obituaries, and other information that may have been left behind. They spent the entire sorting through fragile papers and faded materials in hopes that we may uncover something there. The Langford name was occasionally mentioned in pictures, property deeds, and marriages. A brief obituary for Jacob and a license for Samuel and Evelyn. But what attracted Caleb's attention was a handwritten note with a wobbly handwriting that was dated the day following Jacob's death, found placed within one of the papers. However, the message was clear. "We can't stay here if they returned yesterday night. They will steal everything if they catch us." Caleb read the note out loud, his voice ejecting in shock. Who were they and where were they? Whoever they were, it sounded like Samuel, and they became frightened by Walter's face. Samuel may have gone into hiding since Evelyn, and he were fleeing from them. But why would he remain so near the grave? Walter leaned back when Caleb inquired if he would have gone farther if he had been jogging. Perhaps he wasn't fleeing, but perhaps he was massaging his temples in his chair. That night, while defending something, Caleb went back into the forest, unable to ignore the questions that were racing through his. Keep in mind that the horse followed him without question, showing everlasting loyalty. Together, they went back to the ruins and Jacob's grave as Caleb. When he looked more closely, he saw something he had previously overlooked. A faint, nearly undetectable trail heading. The horse's ears perked up as it sniffed at the ground farther into the woods, perhaps inviting Caleb to follow it with a torch. Caleb set out on the route, which was small and covered in trees, crowding in on both sides. The atmosphere grew more suffocating the deeper he went, the colder the air seemed. And after what seemed like hours, Caleb emerged into the eerie calm that replaced the sounds of the jungle. In the middle of another clearing was a rundown cabin with a collapsed roof. Caleb's spine tingled at the sight of its aging, blackened walls. Caleb approached slowly, his torch beam cutting as the horse snorted nervously, its hooves slapping at the earth. He discovered the remains of a lifetime abandoned in the cabin's gloom. A dusty table with shattered furniture, papers all over the place, and one unlit lantern. However, what he discovered on the distant wall, carved into the wood in a desperate manner, was what stopped him in his tracks. Caleb stood frozen, staring at the letters that were the words that would never stop them. The words "they will never stop" were engraved on the cabin wall, and their menacing tone made him shudder. The horse snorted softly against the silence of the deserted forest, providing a little solace in the suffocating environment. He cautiously walked up to the wall and ran his fingertips over the characters' deep grooves in the wood. Were haphazardly carved, perhaps in a state of despair, and this cabin wasn't merely a. Caleb sensed that the sanctuary had been Samuel Langford's final haven. His torch lighted more of the cabin among the nearly tangible weight of despair that hung in the air. Detritus beneath a heap of rotten cloth. A metal box was partially concealed, Caleb. The box was locked, yet he hesitated before going for it, his pulse accelerating. The clasp was deteriorated by years of exposure, and when it was firmly pulled, it gave apart within. Additional messages that resembled those discovered at the ruins, but they were shorter, hurried, and terrified. "They're keeping an eye on us, Evelyn. I saw the light again tonight, and I'll protect Jacob. Don't return no matter what. They came for the others, and I won't allow them to take him either. The price, if you discover this. I apologize for trying." The previous letter was smudged with. Caleb's chest constricted as he read what appeared to be dried blood or dirt, its words hardly readable. These weren't merely the digressions of a man in need. They were an appeal and evidence of a father's determination to shield his family from. Caleb's silence was broken by a sound outside that no one else could understand or believed. Just outside the cabin, Focus the horse gave a low, nervous whinny. The jungle was quiet when Caleb's torch rushed to the door, but the uneasiness he had previously experienced came back more intense then. What was it that made his breath visible in the chilly night air before he went outside? He stroked the horse's neck and asked the youngster, whose ears were pinned back. With his body tight, Caleb used his torch to search the tree line in the dark and noticed a feint. His heart raced when he saw the flickering light deep in the jungle approaching him steadily, and realizing it wasn't a deception. The light was real in his mind, and as it drew nearer, Caleb retreated. His thoughts were racing as he made his way towards the cabin, wondering who or what might be out there. The horse shifted uneasily next to them, thinking that staying put would be riskier than running off into the woods. Caleb's instincts were on high alert as the light suddenly stopped and hovered in the distance. He held his breath. He tightened the torch, but to his astonishment, a second and then a third light emerged, forming a loose triangle. The phrases from the letters reverberated in his mind as their movements strangely synchronized. "Tonight, I saw the lights once more," Caleb called out into the darkness, gathering his bravery. "Who's there? Show yourself." Instead of responding, the lights started to move once more, this time in a circle. Caleb's heart pounded in the cabin. He had to take action and quickly turned to face the horse. He took the reins and guided the beast towards the tiny trail they had entered, whispering, "We're leaving this place." Caleb prodded the horse as it hesitated, its hoof striking the dirt. As they proceeded further, the lights uncannily followed their movements as the jungle appeared to shut in around them. Caleb continued to look over his shoulder, his breath coming in quick, deliberate breaths. Sharp explosions made it difficult to see the trail beneath the tree's canopy, but he persisted out of instinct and dread. When Caleb and the horse finally came out of the forest after what seemed like a lifetime, the open meadow brought a. He turned back towards the forest line, expecting the lights to halt at the edge, but the relief was fleeting. Instead, the horse reared up and let out as they kept streaming into the clearing. Caleb was so scared that he had to fight to keep his own fear from overwhelming him. Caleb protected his eyes as the lights became brighter and their shapes changed, becoming almost humanoid, but not quite. The intensity of the illumination was dazzling, so he cried, "Stay back." His voice broke. "What are you?" Want for the lights to pause. Lingering just out of reach, the meadow was quiet save for the horse's labored breathing, and then the lights abruptly went out as soon as they appeared. Caleb felt the blackness return, heavy and oppressive, as he dissolved into the night. The horse stood shaking next to him, its flanks heaving, and he fell to his knees, his heart thumping in his chest. Caleb understood that whatever had just transpired was not over, since the lights were still there, and they were waiting back at the stable. Told Gus what had happened that night, and the elderly man listened in silence, his countenance grim. Gus leaned closer and remarked in a quiet voice, "You've seen what Samuel saw." Once Caleb was done. "You now know why he never left. But what are they?" Caleb inquired, his tone becoming desperate. "I don't know, boy, but whatever they are," Gus shook his head after him and asked why I did. Caleb spent the next few days in a state of discomfort because they are connected to that forest, first to Samuel and now to you. He was plagued by memories of the lights and their strange behavior, which persisted in his mind at all times. He saw them circle the cottage and pursuing him through the forest when he closed his eyes, and he knew they weren't merely figments of his imagination, but they were genuine and still existed. The horse had also shifted from being serene and once stoic. It was now twitchy, moving erratically, and suddenly even in the security of. It appeared that Gus's ears were always twitching, as though they were listening for. Gus's words echoed in Caleb's head, something only it could hear, whatever they. To Samuel, they were connected to that forest, but to you, it was obvious that this wasn't about anything. After Samuel Langford unintentionally wandered into it, while attempting to shield Caleb, he became involved in the plot. In search of answers, Caleb made the decision to go to the local library in the hopes of learning more about the background of the Samuel's family, the forest, and the librarian, Mrs. Peterson, a gentle old woman. When he described what he was searching for, she gave him a warm greeting, and her demeanor darkened. "You're not the first person to arrive," she answered cautiously when asked about the Langford family, "but I'll caution you that what you learn might not bring you." Caleb nodded in silence, robbing himself. "I must know." Mrs. Peterson took him to a. She began by saying, "A section of old newspapers and local records is laid out on the table in several bound volumes." As Caleb turned the delicate pages, he noticed a troubling pattern that covered the years Samuel lived out there. Numerous reports of unexplained disappearances and unusual happenings in the woodland. With reports of unexplained lights, the articles covered decades with each incident. One headline drew Caleb's attention because it was uncannily identical to what he had experienced. Tragic events occur when the Langford family's son is mysteriously lost in a wilderness. See the following article. Described how Jacob D., Samuel's little son, disappeared one night and was never seen again. Once more, search teams spent weeks searching the forest, but all they discovered were odd scorch marks on the ground and a burned wooden. Caleb's stomach rumbled as he read that Samuel had fled to the cabin following the loss of the boy's toy, unwilling to communicate with anyone other than his wife Evelyn, who departed soon after. Samuel's mental state was the subject of rumors. Some said he had gone insane, while others suggested he was cursed. Samuel said, "They took my boy. They'll take more," at the article's bottom, referring to the woodland. Armed with this new knowledge, Caleb went back to Gus's stable and relayed what he had discovered, saying, "If we don't stop them." Gus listened quietly, while wearing a worried expression in the hopes that the elderly man might have some wisdom and that it wasn't just Samuel. Jacob didn't notice the lights, but Caleb, who was pacing the barn, reported that others had. "I doubt that he usually did." Samuel, did he simply vanish? Did he sigh deeply? He spent the rest of his life trying to understand why he thought those lights, whatever they were, had taken him. Gus hesitated as Caleb questioned, "Do you think you found a way to stop them?" "I'll tell you this. Those lights are deadly." Ben shook his head, indicating that he didn't live to tell anyone about it. "You were fortunate to escape that forest because they have existed longer than any of us and never abandoned survivors." As Gus's comments weighed heavily on Caleb's shoulders, he remembered the horse near the forest's edge. And every night, pulled to something invisible, he saw Samuel etching frantic warnings on the walls of the hut. Finally, Caleb replied, "I have to go back," as he thought about Jacob, a youngster who had been lost to a forest that no one could comprehend. Gus's eyes expanded. "Are you insane?" You barely survived the first time. I cannot simply leave it this way, Caleb answered in a firm voice. If Samuel was correct, if there was a way to stop them, then I owe it to him, to Jacob, to everyone who has been harmed by this, and I must try. How about you? Gus shot back. What if you don't return? Caleb looked at him. If his eyes are flaming with resolve, then at least I'll know I gave a shot that evening. Caleb packed a torch, a knife, and the letters he had discovered in the jungle in preparation for his return. When Caleb opened the cabin, the horse observed him quietly from its stall, its dark eyes conveying a quiet understanding. The horse moved forward without hesitation at the stable door, as though it understood its role in the trip. We're doing this together, aren't we? Caleb murmured, placing a hand on its neck and pulling strength from its constant presence. Caleb got a sense of foreboding as they reached the woodland, and the horse gave him a gentle prod as though it agreed. The trees loomed over him like silent sentries, their branches twisting. The air was heavy and packed with an unsaid tension that caused the horse to form strange patterns against the starry sky. Caleb paused at the forest line, but he didn't turn away. He inhaled deeply before moving forward to lead. The horse trailed behind him, its hoofs crunching quietly against the. As they descended down into the frost-covered terrain, the forest appeared to come to life, with shadows dancing in the corners of. As Caleb's vision and the subtle hum of an invisible force vibrated through the atmosphere, he securely grasped the flashlight's beam. The lights appeared just ahead, piercing through the stifling blackness. The lights were dim at first, resembling far-off fireflies, but they became brighter as Caleb and the horse got closer. Caleb's heart raced as they moved more purposefully and even predatorily. However, he continued since he had gone too far to turn back. As Caleb and the horse emerged from the edge of the forest, the enormous, with the gentle rustle of leaves, the wide countryside welcomed them with a serenity that had been lacking for a long time. Replaced the deafening quiet, and the refreshing night air brought a fresh sense of peace. The world felt lighter. The horse halted and looked back as if the weight of the mysterious forces in the forest had been lifted. As though saying goodbye to something invisible, Caleb extended his hand towards the shadowy tree canopy. Whatever kept you there, whatever, he said, it's over. The animal chuckled gently as he leaned into Caleb's touch for the first time, but it's gone now. Understood how much this creature had suffered, and how its journey reflected his own. In the days after Caleb's death, they struggled together to face the future and let go of the hurt that bound them to the past. Went back to his regular position as a ranger, but the experience of the horse story had a lasting impact on him. Had become well known in the area, but Caleb decided to keep the more profound facts to himself. To most, it was a story of loyalty, and the mystery of a horse waiting at the edge of the woodland for unknown reasons. I completely get it, but Caleb spent more time with the horse because he understood better. The animal, which the community lovingly called Spirit, had come to represent resiliency and hope, attracting tourists. Children who came to visit the forest because Guardian would chuckle as they ran their fingers through Spirit's man. Caleb couldn't help but smile at the happiness the horse brought to people one day as it rang out like bells. Caleb saw a tiny leather tag sewn into Spirit's warning halter as he was combing his coat. He carefully untied it and looked at the faded inscription to Jacob, which he had previously overlooked in the midst of the recent upheaval. The words struck him like a tidal wave. My guiding star, may you always find your way home. It became evident that Spirit Jacob and Samuel Langford were connected, had served as more than just a horse. He had been Jacob's friend and lifeline. Caleb felt a connection to the memories of love and family. As he ran his palm over the carved letters, a knot formed in his throat. Your loyalty brought us here, Caleb muttered. You never stopped believing in him, and none of us were discouraged by his faltering voice. With the assistance of the local community, Caleb organized the inscription in order to commemorate the legacy of the Langford family. People gathered beneath a modest memorial at the edge of the woodland where the tale of Spirit and the lights had started. Candles, flowers, and handwritten letters of appreciation are brought by twilight sky as. Caleb stepped in front of the throng and inhaled deeply. This was more than a horse waiting at the. He started out with a voice full of quiet strength, describing the border of the woodland. Love, loss, and the inseparable connection between caring humans and animals. Spirit reminded us that the horse was peacefully standing next to him, regal, as though realizing the moment Caleb put the leather tag on a little wooden plaque. Names of Jacobs and Samuel were written, and occasionally the gathering became silent as the memorial's weight settled over them. Caleb went on to say that even while the solutions we're looking for don't materialize as planned, the journey is still worthwhile. As the candles went out, we discovered meaning in the enduring. Caleb stayed by the plaque spirit at his side as the throng dispersed. Above their light, stars glistened, serving as a soft reminder of the invisible forces that initially fashioned their universe. Caleb experienced a deep sense of calm and a silent acceptance of the. He dug into his pocket and took out the torch he had used to solve mysteries that would never be fully understood. With a faint smile, he set it next to the plaque that served as a reminder of his voyage in A. In the months that followed, the forest stayed silent as a metaphor of a light he had discovered in the darkest of places. Spirit, whose story inspired a local, became a permanent feature in the community with unexplained lights that never came back. Caleb is a charity that supports conservation and animal welfare. Plunged himself into his job with a fresh sense of purpose after an evening of encounters that strengthened his bond with the country. Caleb stood at the edge of the woodland, watching the sun set. Spirit was grazing nearby, and he allowed the silence to wash over him. He mumbled, "Thank you," as the sound of nature filled the room that had been filled with uncertainty and worry. He wasn't certain who he was addressing, though. Possibly Samuel, whose sacrifice had rescued him. He may have been led by a spirit whose devotion had led him to the forest itself, that had put him to the test, and in doing so, Spirit lifted his head, his ears twitching towards Caleb as though he were responding, and Caleb gave a quiet laugh. Caleb felt lighter as they left the jungle, touching the side of the horse and said, "Let's go home, buddy." With the past no longer weighing heavily on him, he had confronted the darkness and come out on the other side with a tale of love and resiliency. He found comfort in the unwavering spirit of those who persisted, if you were affected by the spirits. Amazing tale of bravery and loyalty. Just think of all the other tales of animals, and they're everlasting. This story, which is bonds waiting to be told, serves as a reminder of the strength of tenacity, and the bonds that are stronger than words. Please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and motivational tales like this one. Don't miss our upcoming film, which will take you on another unforgettable journey and leave you in awe of the creature's tenacity and the affection they provide us. Go here to view the following tale and join us in honoring the amazing human-animal relationships.